Yes, so my name is John Evans. I work as a translator for the European Commission. I'm going to speak briefly about the work of translators in the EU institutions, but also I'll cover the whole range of different careers that are available in the EU institutions as well. So my background, I'm originally from West Wales. I went to my local comprehensive where I studied French. I don't have parents who speak French or German. We were Welsh and English speaking, and that's it. I went on to university to do French and Spanish. I spent a year abroad in Spain and some time in France. I taught English for a year after graduation, and then I came back to the UK and I did a postgraduate diploma in translating and interpreting. I worked for a few years in the British Civil Service as a linguist, and then I worked for a UN agency in Switzerland, and then I worked for about 6 years in Luxembourg as a translator, so translating documents, written documents, and then for the past 3 years I've been working in the Commission's office in London, still for the translation service, but my job is more involved in outreach activities. So we work a lot with schools to try and encourage more young people to study languages. We do a lot with universities talking about careers in translating and interpreting, but also general EU careers. And then I'm involved in organising all sorts of different events related to languages and a bit with culture as well. So in the EU institutions, we have, I suppose, 3 different roles for linguists, whereas maybe if you're working on the private market, you might be doing some translating and some interpreting. With us, you're either a translator or an interpreter, and then we also have lawyer linguists. So interpreters obviously are the people you see in the booths at the big conferences and smaller meetings as well. So they're doing the simultaneous interpretation where they're listening to somebody giving a speech possibly in French, and then they're listening and giving that speech back in English. To work as an interpreter, you have to have a postgraduate qualification in interpreting, and that's simply because you need that year of training to develop those skills to work as an interpreter. We also have lawyer linguists. They're a particular breed of linguists, I suppose, insofar as you need to have a legal qualification as well as the language skills. So the lawyer linguists at the Court of Justice, for example, at the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, they translate EU case law, they translate judgments from national courts. So in addition to having the language knowledge, they need that legal expertise as well. And it's important for lawyer linguists to have that legal qualification from the country of the language that they work into. So, for example, if you were working as a Bulgarian lawyer linguist, you would need a law degree from Bulgaria, not the UK, because you need the knowledge of the legal system in your country. And then we also have lawyer linguists at the council and at the parliament, but they're not really translators. They're much more involved in drafting of legislation. So it's a different type of role again. Translators, then obviously we deal with written communication. We translate documents. In the English department that I worked for in the European Commission, we have a real need to cover all the EU languages apart from Irish. The Irish translators work into English and into Irish. So most of the translators will be British and Irish, and they will have a background in the sort of common languages that we'll have learned at university. So French, German, Spanish, Italian, maybe Dutch, Portuguese. And then because we need people to work from the other EU languages, particularly the Central Eastern European languages, most of us then are asked or encouraged to learn those other languages. So after I joined the Commission, I very quickly started learning Polish. I had Polish classes during my working time. I was sent to Poland a couple of times to attend some courses there as well. And then I started working from Polish probably after about 2.5 years maybe. But obviously when I started working from Polish, I didn't have a particularly good knowledge of the language, so all my work was being revised by colleagues who had a much better knowledge than me. And also I could go to my Polish colleagues in the Polish department and ask them for help as well. So we have a lot of work in those languages, and there's not so many of us with them. So once you start working from them, you're using those languages quite a lot. So it's a good opportunity to learn new language, and something that I particularly enjoyed. So the selection procedure for translators is very similar to the selection procedure for all kinds of different jobs in the EU. So yes, we have linguists, but they're just a small fraction of the sort of jobs that we have. So we have jobs for lawyers, economists, statisticians, nuclear inspectors, veterinary inspectors. If you think about what the EU does and that it's a civil service, then we have a whole range of different jobs. For all those jobs, you do have to have a second language. The second language must be English, French, or German. So if English is your mother tongue, it has to be French or German. If French is your mother tongue, it must be German or English. If you're not English, French, or German, then it must be your second language must be one of those. In terms of what sort of standard you need, I would say you probably need A-level standard or above, really. So part of the application procedure, you have to do an assessment center. And you have to do that assessment center in your second language. So you need to be able to do an interview, for example, in that language. On the application procedure then, the first part you have to apply online, fill in an online application form, and then there are computer-based tests. So verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning, which you would do in your mother tongue. With these tests, it's important to practice them. They're very similar to the British Civil Service test. So I imagine your careers library has examples. You can also find examples on the internet. You can buy books to practice as well, because it's only the people who do very well in these tests. So it could be the top 1%, the top 5%, top 10%, depending on how many applicants there are, who will get through to the next stage. So I really emphasize, practice these tests, get used to doing them under time conditions. So after the computer-based tests, there's an assessment center where you would have a structured interview, a group exercise, and an oral presentation. There would then be some practical tests. So for translators, there are translation tests, interpreters tests. For lawyers, there would be a case study on some sort of legal aspect as well. The assessment center, yes, you would do it in your second language, but it's not a test of your language skills. It's competency-based. So they're looking for skills. And the skills they're looking for are the same sorts of skills that I think most big graduate employers are looking for. So it's things like organizing and prioritizing, delivering results, analysis, working with people, communication skills. So it's those sorts of skills that you need to demonstrate in those tests and to give examples of maybe in the interview. So my advice would be to think, take a look at those competencies and think of examples of things that you've done that can show those skills, whether it's working in a summer job, or whether it's running a student organization. So for example, I worked as a waiter in Disneyland Paris, and when I had a competency-based interview to work in the British Civil Service, I didn't have any real work experience behind me, only summer jobs. So, if someone asked me at the interview, which they did, can you give me an example of dealing with difficult people, then I had plenty of examples to draw on there, and most of them were with my colleagues and not with customers. But you just have to think objectively about all the things that you've done up until now, and what examples can you give to show that you've got these skills. I'll just talk briefly then about the current opportunities that we have. So we recruit graduates every year, different times of year for different profiles. So for example, in March every year we're looking for general graduate level entry. Sometimes we look in particular for people with a background in law or economics. At the moment, there's one just open for graduates general, so it can be any career background. I'm just going to show a couple of slides from here. So you can find the links. But also, if you go on the EU Careers website, you'll find these. So it's just eu-careers.eu, or just Google EU Careers and you'll find it. So if you're in your final year, or if you're already graduated, you can apply for the General Graduates Competition. There's also one just open for auditors to work at the Court of Auditors. For that, you would need a background in finance, economics, business, something related. There are competitions coming up for forensic analysts and also, I think, nuclear inspectors, if anybody has that sort of background. So we have jobs in all kinds of things. So even science-based jobs there are there too. If anybody's interested in translation, this year we'll be recruiting translators to work into, probably, not confirmed, but probably it will be into Swedish, German, Spanish, and Greek. So we're looking for Spanish translators, Greek translators, Swedish, and German translators. One other opportunity is the traineeships that we run. Each of the institutions runs its own traineeship scheme, so it's worth looking at all of them. So the European Parliament, the European Commission, the Council, even the smaller organizations like the Court of Auditors, also look at the different EU agencies. In London, there's the European Medicines Agency. In Italy, you have the European Food Safety Authority. There are lots of these different agencies. It's worth looking into the traineeships that they do. They're nearly all paid. At the Commission, it's about €1,000 a month for a 5-month traineeship. I think there's a couple of links here as well. For the European Parliament, it's already, the application period is just open, so you can already apply for that. It is competitive, but if you're a Brit, you stand a better chance because there are fewer Brits applying. Just to give you some figures, I think for the traineeship for last October then, I think you stood maybe a 1 in 8 chance of getting a place if you were British, whereas if you were Italian, you know, here we go. So there were 378 applications for 45 places. So 378 applications from Brits for 45 places for Brits. So it's about 1 in 6, 1 in 8 chance. Whereas for Italians, 4,000 applications for 79 places. Okay, and one thing I would add as well, with those permanent positions, Brits are in demand. I was at a meeting this morning, a big EU careers event at the Foreign Office, and some of the Brits there who've just started working in institutions were saying that the British people who get through the competition are recruited very quickly. English is the common working language in the institution. So if you are a native English speaker, it does open doors, it does give you an advantage. And you know, if you do get through to the assessment centre, do get in touch with the UK representation in Brussels, also the EU staffing unit in Whitehall in the civil service. They provide a lot of help to people who are going through the tests. If you're not British, look into your own national administration. What support do they provide? I think a lot of the other national administrations provide coaching and support as well. Yeah, if you want more information as well, the EU Careers website has probably got everything as well.
I'm interested in internship with the European Parliament. What's the best moment to apply for the internship? Rather after my graduation, or in the summer, like after second, third year, and also what kind of roles should I expect as an intern? Yeah, it's a question too, I think.
Yeah, so you also have the institutional traineeships. I'm not so familiar with the Parliament traineeship because I work at the Commission, but it's very similar. So for the Commission, and I think the Parliament is the same, it's an online application, so you don't have to go through all those tests. So it's a lot more straightforward. My advice there would be to look into what the Parliament does, which different departments of the Parliament you can work in, what interests you, and explain what interests you and why you want to work in those departments on your application as well. But look into it. But don't just think about the Parliament. As I say, they're quite competitive. So look more broadly at all the institutions and the agencies as well. I would say as well for the competitions for permanent staff, you don't need a master's. Having said that, most of the people probably will have a master's. And I would say maybe not 10, 15 years experience, but a lot of people, I think the average age of people who are successful is more late 20s, 29, 30. So it's people that maybe have a master's and some experience behind them, although people do pass straight out of university as well. That's what I would say.
Are there any opportunities regarding people that hold, for example, dual citizenship of a non-EU country and the EU country to maybe work in the field of non-EU and EU relations, maybe? Is there any opportunity?
So, what your question before?
General question, I would say, maybe if anybody knows.
I'm not really sure if I've understood, but do you have EU nationality? Yeah. Well, so yeah, for all EU posts, you have to have EU nationality, but obviously the EU deals with all kinds of, deals with agreements with countries from all over the world. So, you do have departments that are dealing on external relations, that are dealing with Russia or with Asia or Latin America. So there are opportunities there, yes.
2 questions. Is Russian one of the languages that's useful in the EU? And the other is there an age and upper age limit for applications?
There's no real age limit. Well, over 65, which is when you have to retire. But we have people coming to join us, who are coming in their 50s. Russian isn't an official language, so you wouldn't be able to apply with, you have to have English plus French or German if English is your native, is your mother tongue. If you're working as a translator, for example, Russian is an EU language, but we have colleagues who on the basis of Russian can translate from Bulgarian, for example. So look at it a bit more strategically. Having said that, if you're working in a policy area that's dealing with Russian, then Russian can be very useful. For example, I was at this FCO event this morning on EU Careers, and there was a Brit who was working in the European Parliament on in a unit that deals with Belarus, with Ukraine, and Russia, and he was learning Russian on the job for that. And he was saying a lot of the people working in that unit were from Eastern European countries who had a knowledge of Russian, but they were saying also they need a perspective from Britain as well to bring that in. So you might get the opportunity to use it, but it's not an EU official language. But then it is an official language in the UN, so that's something to bear in mind as well.
If you're trying to be a translator or interpreter for the EU or the UN, apart from a master's, what other stuff do you look for?
In some ways, it's a bit like the fast stream in that what counts is how you perform in the tests. So you have to do well in those first computer-based tests to go through to the translation tests. Then you have to be able to show that you're a good translator or that you're a good interpreter in the interpreting tests. And then the assessment centre is competency-based again. So, if you've had experience abroad, yes, which is good for your language skills, but ultimately it's how you perform in those tests that counts.
On the translation point, I had heard that there was talk of abolishing the requirement for English speakers to have either French and German. Is there any progress on that? And do you need that to be a lawyer linguist as well?
There's not progress at the moment, but we have a lot of people retiring in the English departments of the different translation services of the institutions. And we need people who have those, languages apart from French and German. So we're still working on it, but I won't promise anything because it's the general requirement for all EU posts that you have French or German or English. So for us to say, well, we're different, we're special, you don't need French or German, it's not getting us very far at the moment. So it's unlikely to change. For lawyer linguists, you have to have French or German, and to work at the European Court of Justice, you have to have French because that is the official language of the court. So, I would just think if you don't have French or German, it's just a case of going back, spending some time in a country that speaks that language, going to evening classes, trying to get the French or German up to speed. You don't need a paper qualification in the language. It's about using the language in the tests.
Mine was translation related as well. So, I wanted to ask if for translators whose native language is English, are there any particular language combinations that are really in demand, any sort of shortages?
Anything outside the ordinary. So Central Eastern European, Finnish, Greek, if you've got one of those languages, you'd get snapped up. If you're only offering French or German, French and Spanish, German and Italian, you're going to be recruited probably more slowly, or once you came in, then you would be expected to learn one of the other languages. But having said that, there's very few people out there with those more exotic languages. So, for example, Polish, brilliant. Yeah, if you've got Polish, that's great. Yeah, anything Central Eastern European, Finnish or Greek, that's a real bonus for us.
When you're doing a master's in translation and stuff, is it necessary to specify one language or two?
For us, you need to be able to work from two languages. So really, it's better to do from two languages. But it depends at the university whether they offer classes in translation from those languages. But ultimately, if you've learned to translate from one language, you're still transferring those skills to another language. So it's the same skills you're using.
Languages from Asia, for example, Hindi, are they sought after as well, or?
In the institutions, not really. We do have work from non-EU languages, but the big ones would be Chinese, and then to a lesser extent Arabic and Russian. But most of that work we would outsource, so we would go to freelance translators for that. Having said that, 2 years ago we recruited 2 Chinese translators because the EU deals so much with China, and we have so much work from Chinese into English and English into Chinese that we recruited 2 Chinese translators. So we had, they're only on temporary contracts because they don't meet the requirements of having French and another EU language. They have to have Chinese, English, English, Chinese. So it's a different sort of situation. But Chinese is the only one really where we've gone and actually recruited people with those languages.
How is that in addition to French? Is that
Yeah, you know, if you were offering Hindi as well, if occasionally we might get something in Hindi, you would get to do it probably, but there's very little there.
What are the prospects for Turkish being useful?
Yeah, we have people who've been learning Turkish. Obviously, the EU deals a lot with Turkey, so we're already working from Turkish. But since it's not an EU language yet, at the moment we don't. It's not one of the languages that you would be able to offer to be tested in. So you need to have two languages. So you couldn't offer Turkish as one of those two languages. But if you came in and you had Turkish, then we would give you work to do from Turkish because there's a lot already.